Welcome to the Beach House 34 podcast, the place where we dive deep into stories about true crime and the paranormal. I'm your host, Christine. Tonight, we're heading into the small town of Jennings, Louisiana, where 8 women died mysteriously, some very violently, all between 2005 and 2009. The case of the Jennings 8, sometimes called the Jeff Davis 8, is a case that is still open, still unsolved, and still full of mystery, with people still wanting answers. I want to take a moment before we begin to acknowledge the families of these women and the hard work and dedication of Ethan Brown, an investigative journalist and author who wrote one of the most comprehensive books on this case, Murder in the Bayou, Who Killed the Women Known as the Jeff Davis 8. I also want to acknowledge the families of these women who are still hurting and are still looking for answers. This episode is for them and for anyone else who wants to see closure to this case and not let it become a black hole case, one of those cases that has no hope of resolution. The morning of May 20th, 2005, in Jennings, Louisiana, was already hot and muggy. The kind of humidity that wraps you in this blanket of dampness the moment that you walk out your door. Jennings is a small town, just under 11,000 people, in the southern part of Louisiana, just west of Lafayette. In general, the pace of Jennings is slow. You've got your high school football games, you have trains running through the center of town, and pews are pretty much filled up in church on Sundays. It's also a place where families have known each other for generations and where everyone seems to be related to someone you know. But on this morning, just outside of town, a man is fishing near a bridge in the East Fork of the Grand Marais Canal off of Louisiana Highway 1126. It's around 3 miles from Jennings when he sees something strange in the water. At first, he thinks it's a mannequin, but as he looks at it closer, he realizes that it doesn't quite look right. It looks different, and it has flies hovering all around it. He realizes he's looking at a dead body. The authorities are called, and within hours, the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office has a name: Loretta Chason Lewis. She's 28 years old, a mother of 2, struggling with drug addiction, but by most accounts, trying to turn her life around. Her father would later say that just days before she disappeared, Loretta had confided in a friend that she wanted to leave this life behind. She wanted to finally just be a mom to her kids. But now, she's a crime scene. She was found partially clothed, and after an autopsy, there were no physical injuries found. Her grandfather would later say, "We never really knew how she died. That's what's so bad about it. They said she had some drugs in her, but that's all they told us." Jennings isn't a place that's used to violent death. As a matter of fact, it has a very low incidence of homicides. So when the body was found and it was discovered that it was one of their own, a Jennings resident, it hit the town hard. But then, 17 days later, another body turns up. This one is found by a group of froggers. These are folks who hunt frogs at night. While they're out in their boat, they catch a whiff of something rotten, and as they move their flashlights over the water, they see her, the second victim of what will eventually be called the Jennings 8. This victim was 29-year-old Ernestine Danielle Patterson. She was found just 6 miles away from where Loretta was located. This town, not known for homicides by any stretch of the imagination, now has 2 within a month, and they're both young women. To understand what happened in Jennings, you have to first understand the place itself. Jennings sits in the heart of Jefferson Davis Parish, which is why this case is sometimes called the Jeff Davis 8. A railroad track runs through Jennings, and this is quite literally the dividing line between the more affluent neighborhood, the north side, and the working class or south side. Up north, you have doctors, lawyers, and small business owners, but south of the tracks is described as, quote, economically disadvantaged. Most of these women were small time drug users, often described as working girls by the local press and law enforcement. This is a label that quickly became a kind of shorthand for, blaming the victims. It's a phrase that Sheriff Ricky Edwards would lean on heavily in the early days, painting these women as casualties of a high risk lifestyle, as if their deaths were just an inevitable consequence of the choices that they'd made. Quote, the women had more than a couple of things in common. All except one lived south of the town's railroad tracks, an economically disadvantaged section of Jennings. And in a town like Jennings, that kind of language, especially considering it came from law enforcement, carried some weight. It sends a message, not just about who these women were, but about who the town thought they weren't. Not daughters, not mothers, not sisters, just women that were murdered as a result of their lifestyle. As the months passed and the bodies continued to surface, rumors of cover-ups, dirty cops, and certain secrets that nobody was revealing. Now, when Loretta was first found, it was a terrible tragedy for Jennings. She was just 28, and she had struggled with addiction. Now, some blamed her lifestyle, which maybe made people feel like it was a way to deal with their grief and try to move on, hoping that the police would catch whoever was responsible. Loretta, though, didn't have any wounds that were visible, and tragically, no cause of death was ever determined for her. Or if it was, no one was ever told of it. She did have high levels of alcohol and drugs in her body after this autopsy. But as we'll see, this seems to be kind of the go-to answer for many of the Jennings 8. But then 17 days after Loretta was discovered, a second body surfaced. Ernestine Daniels Patterson, a mom of 4, was discovered by that group of froggers. The thing was that unlike Loretta, Ernestine's throat had been slashed and her face had been beaten beyond recognition. It would actually take 3 months for the coroner to identify her. After Ernestine was identified, Sheriff Ricky Edwards said, quote, there's definitely obvious physical injuries. There was definitely a struggle. The body appeared to have been in the water a day or two, and the body was sent to the coroner's office for an autopsy, unquote. When he was asked if it was related to the death of Loretta, he said, it's too early to compare the two. The only similarity is that the bodies were dumped off. So now, the bodies of 2 women, both from Jennings, had been found in similar locations. Both of them mothers, both of them with histories of addiction, and both of them known well on the south side of Jennings. But there were big differences in how they died. Loretta had no obvious signs, and Ernestine had been brutalized. Even though it was tough for the families of the victims and the town of Jennings, after some months had passed, people started to feel a little bit safer, just a little bit. No other women had been found, and for nearly 2 years, it was quiet. There was frustration, of course. No one had been arrested, and families were upset at the lack of progress in the case. But this calm, though, wouldn't last very long. On March 8th of 2007, Kristen Gary Lopez, who was 21, was reported missing. Now, friends, though, they found it strange that she would have been reported at all, because they said that it wasn't unusual for her to be gone for days or even a week at a time. So to have her reported as missing seemed a little off. If she's been gone before and no one bothered to report her missing, Could someone have known that she was in danger? But then 10 days later, she's found in the Petit Canal. This is about 10 miles west of Jennings. She was partially nude and badly decomposed. Kristen had actually been in the water for much longer than the first two victims. No cause of death was determined, but it was mentioned that she too had high levels of alcohol and drugs found in her body. Kristen also had a history of drug use and had been known well on the south side of Jennings. So now, the small town of Jennings had 3 bodies of young women die in 3 years. All of them were addicts, and according to police, living a high-risk lifestyle, which makes it feel as though law enforcement was trying to make something less of their deaths. As a matter of fact, Sheriff Ricky Edwards, he was quick to remind the public of these facts every time a new body surfaced. Never mind that they had children, families, friends, they were connected to each other. To law enforcement, it felt as if the only thing that mattered was their lifestyle. After the discovery of Kristen, the third body, months and then years went by with no answers from the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office. They knew people were scared, and they knew that the longer they took to solve the case, the more distrust the public would have in them. Each of these women had ties to the same circle of friends, the same dealers, and they all lived or were known on the south side of town. And yet, despite some of these very obvious connections, the investigation felt very scattered and unfocused. The work of a department that was maybe stretched too thin, and some would even say uninterested in solving the cases of these women. When Kristen was found, though, it ramped up the pressure on the sheriff's office, and people started to ask, was there a serial killer living among them? A very legitimate question. Why were these women showing up within this same small area? And why hadn't anybody been arrested? Since the public wasn't really getting any answers from law enforcement, they kind of started making up their own theories. They talked about drug dealers, they talked about pimps and predators in their small town. But, it didn't stop there. They began to talk about local law enforcement and how they might not be screwing up the investigation at all, but rather covering up for somebody. And there was a reason for this. Not long after Kristen was found, there was a scandal in the sheriff's office. One of the chief investigators, Warren Gary, purchased a truck from an inmate named Connie Seiler. She was a small-time drug dealer, and she was known to many of the victims. Many witnesses had come forward after Kristen was found to say that she had been seen riding in this same white truck before she disappeared. Yet somehow, Connie still owned this truck, and Warren Gary, one of the investigators, quietly purchased this truck for just over $8,000. After he bought the truck, he then scrubbed it clean and resold it for a profit. Now, later, he would end up paying a $10,000 fine for violating state ethics laws, but it was too little too late. Any evidence that Kristen had been in that truck was long gone by now. He was pulled from the case. For the families of the victims, this just felt like confirmation of what they had already suspected. The police were more worried about themselves than they were in finding out or protecting whomever killed these girls. And then, in May of 2007, a fourth body, Whitney Dubois, 26, was found just south of Jennings, near where the others had been found. But Whitney wasn't found in the water. She was instead located on a rural road. She had been beaten so badly that her face was unrecognizable. When relatives were notified, they said, quote, "Maybe it's not true. Maybe it's a mistake." Now, Whitney was evidently first located by an associate of Frankie Richard, and this is a name that you're going to be hearing a lot of. This associate said that he had seen Whitney's body, but the story is that he was driving down the road when he saw her, but he didn't want to stop because he had drugs in his vehicle. He later went back in a different vehicle and then called 911. Whitney, like the others, were all connected. She too lived and worked on the south side of Jennings. Her boyfriend was actually the brother-in-law of Loretta. So now there's more women found dead and still no answers from the police. Families would try and call and were stonewalled. Whenever they did speak to someone, they got the same answer about the girls' lifestyles, the drugs, and who they hung around. Another year goes by. Still no answers, no arrests, and then another body. This time it was in May of 2008. Laconia, who went by Muggy Brown, was 23. She was last seen by her grandmother just hours before her body was found in the middle of a road near a police shooting range. She had been found with her throat cut, 7 cuts to her neck, and 3 behind her right ear. Because she hadn't been in the water and was found relatively soon after her grandmother said she had last seen her, you would think that this would have been a break in the case. But according to the Shreveport Times, she was found doused in bleach, destroying most of the evidence. Her family also said that she had been wrapped in a red carpet. 4 months later, another body. This time it was Crystal Benoit Zeno, 24. She was found in a dry canal just south of Jennings, but she had been found after quite some time. She had actually been in that location for so long that her body was badly decomposed, and it would take almost 2 months to identify her. Now, Crystal was someone who was known to be a latecomer to the work and drug areas of South Jennings, but she had become friends with Frankie Richard's brother, Billy. Her death, like the others, was ruled a homicide. But how she was murdered has not been made public. And then, on November 2nd, 2008, Brittany Gary, 17, disappeared after walking to a nearby Family Dollar store to purchase minutes for her cell phone. She is known to have done drugs. She knows all the victims, including her cousin, Kristen. Brittany would finally be located on November 15th, 2008, and she would be found in the same area around where the other bodies were found. She was not in the water. She was in the grass off of Keystone Road, and this was about a half-mile south of Louisiana 1126. And if you remember, that's around the area where Loretta was found. The initial ID of her body was reportedly based on her tattoos, but this claim has been disputed by her family because they insist that her body was too decomposed for the tattoos to even be visible. A quote from a family member said, quote, "She was identified by her tattoos. What tattoos? There were no tattoos visible. She had been out there from the 2nd to the 15th. There was nothing to Brittany, nothing. That was all there was, just black bone," unquote. There's also some troubling implications about Brittany's final movements. At least one witness told investigators that Brittany was seen getting into a vehicle with a known associate of the Jennings 8 case, Danny Berry, shortly before her death. Now, Danny Berry, he happened to be a jailer at the Jefferson Davis Parish Jail, and he was responsible for the floor where many of the women who eventually became the Jennings 8 would go after being arrested. He had a history of mistreating and abusing inmates, some claiming that he would take mace and just spray it into the cells for fun. Aside from this, he was known outside of work as someone who would pick up workers in South Jennings and then bring them back to his trailer. This trailer was known to have some of the walls lined with plastic sheeting, and I immediately pictured a scene right out of Dexter. He was also known to keep chains and other materials associated with certain acts in these rooms. Several witnesses said they saw him driving the streets of Jennings along with his wife to pick up girls. Now, even though many witnesses placed him in direct contact with the victims, he was interviewed once by law enforcement, and this interview lasted 15 to 20 minutes. He said he didn't know any of the victims and said, quote, "I get a good night's sleep every night. That's it. I ain't worried about nothing because I said we ain't done nothing," unquote. And yep, he said we. What does he mean by we? Unfortunately, we'll never know the answer to that because he passed away in 2010. But he wasn't the only person who seemed to have a relationship with all of these victims. One of the main suspects that I mentioned earlier was this man named Frankie Richard. He was a self-admitted crack addict. He was a drug dealer and a strip club owner. And as mentioned, he knew all the victims personally. He partied with them, was known to have intimate relationships with them, and in some cases, claimed to even care for them. When it came to Kristen, he had what he called a complicated relationship and admitted that he was one of the last people to see her alive. Kristen had been staying at a motel that was under Frankie's control, and he allegedly threw her out after she tried to steal from him. Now, even though there were all these associations with Frankie, and multiple witnesses placed him right in the middle of this chaos of all of these women, he denied having been involved in any of the murders. One of these witnesses was his associate slash friend named Eugene Dog Ivory, who reportedly threatened a woman and said, "If you tell anyone, bitch, you will end up like the others." Frankie had this reputation in Jennings as someone you should fear, but also someone you could go to for protection. Frankie was brought in and questioned and had even been arrested in connection with Kristen's murder, but the charges were dropped due to conflicting witness statements and a lack of conclusive evidence. He was also rumored to be a police informant. Many people claimed that he had close ties to the local police department, which the public felt were protecting him. Unfortunately, Frankie passed away on March 22nd of 2020, so we'll never know the truth directly from him. However, he was interviewed extensively in the Murder in the Bayou 5-part series, which you might find interesting. I'll have that link in the show's description if you want to watch it. But Frankie wasn't the only one who was arrested. There were other men that were charged with the second-degree murder in the death of Ernestine, the second victim. But charges here ended up being dropped because the sheriff's office didn't process the crime scene for over 15 months. Of course, over that time, everything you may have hoped to find is going to be gone. As time went on, and the small town of Jennings watched as women and girls from their own tiny community were found murdered, people talked, and they talked a lot about law enforcement officers being involved. Some of the victims of the Jennings 8 were police informants, and many residents believed that they knew too much about how the local drug trade worked. Now, yes, this was their job as informants, but then discovered just how corrupt that law enforcement practices were around this drug trade, and that's why they were killed. In 2008, a multi-agency task force was created to investigate the murders, and from this came a 109-page report that implicates local deputies in the killings, although these leads were never pursued. Now, I couldn't find the report online, at least for the public, but it is talked about in the book, Murder in the Bayou, by investigative journalist Ethan Brown. And I'll have a link in the description for this book for you as well. What is known about this report is that it contains dozens of interviews with witnesses, informants, law enforcement officers, many of which contain allegations of police misconduct, cover ups, and potential involvement in the murders themselves. And then in August of 2009, the eighth victim, Nicole Guillory, who was 26 years old and also a mom of four, she was found about 10 miles from Jennings, dumped along Interstate I-10 near the Egan exit. Her location was quite different from all the others in the group. According to her mom, Nicole had become very paranoid in the months leading up to her murder. Quote, she did not want to go anywhere by herself. Her mom also said that, quote, she used to tell us all the time that it was the police killing the girls. She refused to name them, however, and told her family, quote, it's too far gone. It's too big. I'd rather y'all not know nothing. That way nothing can happen to y'all. She had even placed her children with relatives in the days before she was murdered. So what did she know? She too was known by the other victims and was also known to have a relationship with a man who later admitted to cleaning out the truck that Kristen was last seen in, this same truck that was purchased by a law enforcement officer. The body count in Jennings just kept rising. All these young women, each with ties to the same circle of people. Even though there were obvious connections between all of them, the investigation into their murders seemed to be going nowhere. There were some suspects, we've touched on a couple of them, but whenever the case seemed to be going somewhere, it just stopped. People were angry that law enforcement either didn't know what they were doing or they were really trying to protect one of their own. But what about these rumors of police involvement? Not just that they were screwing up the investigation, but that they may have even participated in these crimes. When you consider the sale of the truck to the chief investigator in this case, you can see how the families of the victims felt like this was a deliberate cover-up. It wasn't the only time that the sheriff's office would find itself in the center of suspicious activity. Another detective in the case, Paula Guillory, lost more than $3,000 in evidence against one of the murder suspects who was later cleared. She was terminated. She played a significant role in the investigation because, according to a private investigator, she was the one who had recruited many of the Jennings 8 victims as informants. She publicly stated, quote, I've never had a female informant, but numerous sources link her to the women. She was also deeply connected to Frankie Richard and his circle. She had participated in a raid on Frankie's home as part of a drug and theft investigation, and it was during this raid that this cash went missing. She claims that she gave it to her superiors as soon as she found it. There was even an internal investigation into her conduct, which was overseen by a totally different department altogether. This resulted in accusations from fellow deputies that she had been involved in drug trafficking and had taken drugs from the evidence room. She was also found to have leaked confidential information. One detective said that, quote, prior to her being hired, they never had anything come up missing from the office. He doesn't trust her because there is information that leaked, and he knows that it came from her. She denied all of these claims. Paula was also previously married to Terry Guillory, who was the warden at the Jefferson Davis Parish Jail during the time when many of these victims of the Jennings 8 were incarcerated. This means that both her and her husband at the time had contact with the women, both inside and outside of the jail. So what about her ex-husband now, Terry? Terry was known as a guy who could make life in jail easier or harder for the inmates depending on their level of cooperation. Witnesses say he could be mean to the women if they didn't do what he wanted. And evidently, this meant certain favors. If they didn't, he would make their lives miserable. He was also the nephew by marriage to Nicole Guillory, the eighth and final known victim. Nicole's mom even claims that Terry once made a inappropriate comment to Nicole, telling her that if they weren't related, he would sleep with her. Loretta, the first known victim, was also allegedly involved with Terry, and witnesses describe a relationship between the two, including accounts of Loretta being given rides home from jail. This is a favor that wasn't usually given to any other inmate. One account even claims that Loretta had been involved with Terry since she was as young as 14 or 15. Terry was also connected to Crystal, who allegedly babysat for him and had what one witness described as a more than friendly relationship with him. Terry was reportedly the last person to speak to Crystal before she disappeared. In regards to this guy, there are multiple allegations that Terry engaged in relationships with female inmates, including some of the Jennings 8 victims. One disturbing account claims that Terry was seen having with Loretta in a jail cell shortly before her death. Despite these allegations, Terry remained in a position of power at the jail throughout the period when the Jennings 8 murders were occurring. This has fueled widespread speculation that he was either involved in the murders directly or helped cover them up to protect himself and his associates. He's also described as a key figure in the local informant network. Documents suggest that many of the women who had become victims had acted as informants for him at various points, providing tips in exchange for lighter sentences or other favors. And this placed them in a very dangerous position, as, informants are often seen as traitors when it comes to tight-knit drug communities. After Crystal's body was discovered, Terry reportedly visited her family's home and, without being asked, just flat out said, "I didn't kill Crystal." A statement that really struck the family as odd. No one had directly accused him at that point. In a totally separate incident, another officer reported that Terry once told him, quote, "You can believe about 95% of what you hear." And this was when this other officer had confronted him about rumors of his involvement in the murders. Now, we've already talked about Frankie being charged with Kristen's murder, but what was not mentioned at the time was that Frankie's niece was also charged, his niece Hannah. The case against both of them fell through when the primary witness in the case admitted to the police that she had lied. She said that she had made up these details of the murder and hadn't actually witnessed it. Originally, she claimed to have seen Frankie and Hannah actually performing the murder, but she later said that she only made the statement to get the police to leave her alone, and that she had been fed the details of the murder by the police themselves until she finally just told them what they wanted to hear. Other folks that were considered people of interest was a man named Harvey Bird Dog Burley. He was well known in the Jennings drug scene, and he knew many of the key players in the Jennings 8 case. He evidently told Whitney's, one of the victims' older brother, Mike, that he was, quote, "close to finding out who killed your sister." Not long after he had this conversation, he was found stabbed to death in his apartment, and his murder remains unsolved. Another name was David Desautels, who was a known drug dealer in Jennings and also had connections to the Jennings 8. He sat down with journalist Ethan Brown, the same guy who wrote the book Murder in the Bayou, And shortly after he spoke to Ethan, he was shot to death inside of his home. The scene at his home wasn't secured by the police, so people were then allowed to go in and out of his home, which of course messed with any evidence there. Now, why it wasn't secured is unknown. Some might even speculate that it was left unsecured on purpose. So we have all of these separate people who are somehow speculated as being involved in this case. We have some that have been arrested and been let go. We have had others who've come in and had conversations for 15 minutes and said, hey, you're good. But to add even a more confusing layer to this case, there is something else that connects many of the Jennings 8, and that's the case of Leonard Crochet. In April of 2005, police who were acting on a tip about drug activity raided a home in South Jennings where Leonard Crochet lived. During this raid, probation and parole agent John Briggs Becton shot and killed Crochet after he thought he saw Crochet reach for something, thinking it was a gun. No evidence of weapons were ever located. According to several witnesses, many of the women, later known as the Jennings 8, were present at this raid. Kristen, the third victim, was there. Another person by the name of Alvin Bootsy Lewis, who happened to be the boyfriend of Whitney, the fourth victim, and the brother-in-law of Loretta, the first victim. Some witnesses even suggested that these women were killed because they had witnessed this shooting or had information about what happened that night. A member of the task force for the Jennings 8 stated, quote, "The victims were being killed because they were present when Leonard Crochet was killed by the police. The girls were being killed because they had seen something they were not supposed to see," unquote. It was only about a month after Leonard was killed that Loretta, victim number 1, was found. According to sources, though, she wasn't present at this raid. But this doesn't mean that someone didn't tell her about it. In December of 2009, 4 months after Nicole, the final victim of the Jennings 8, was located, an article had come out in the Daily Review that said the following. Quote, "Almost all members of the Jennings Police and Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Departments have provided a DNA sample in an effort to allay concerns that a member of law enforcement may be involved in the deaths of 8 women. Personally, what struck me is the term almost. Who didn't provide a DNA sample? So between 2005 and 2009, 8 women were murdered in or near Jennings, Louisiana. It began with Loretta, who was found in 2005. Just 17 days later, Ernestine's body showed up. And the bodies kept coming. There was Kristen, and then Whitney, and then Laconia Muggy Brown. Next, there was Crystal, and then Brittany, just 17 years old. And finally, Nicole. Each of these women had connections to the same small circle of men: drug dealers, jailers, and possible police informants. Frankie Richard, a strip club owner and drug dealer, is the most infamous of these men. He openly admitted to being a crack addict and having intimate relationships with several of the victims, including Kristen. Then there was Danny Berry, a former jailer who was another central figure. He was known for his abusive behavior towards inmates, and many witnesses place him in contact with the victims just before they died. And then there's Terry Guillory, the warden at the Jefferson Davis Parish Jail, who was related to the final known victim, Nicole. He has been repeatedly accused of having inappropriate relationships with several of the victims, including Loretta and Crystal, and using his power as warden to manipulate or intimidate the women in his custody. But then there's this thread, this event that just took place weeks before Loretta was found. Leonard Crochet this known drug dealer was shot and killed by police during a raid on his home. And according to local sources, many of the women later known as the Jennings Eight were present at this raid. Even Frankie Richard himself acknowledged this connection. He said, quote, "Most of them girls was at that raid when that crochet boy got killed. Most of the girls that are dead today were there that night," unquote. And this statement strongly suggests that the women may have seen or known something that made them dangerous witnesses. These women, some of whom were informants for the local narcotics task force, they did move in a dangerous world. But this doesn't mean that they deserved what happened to them. That 109-page task force report that followed their deaths hinted at this broader conspiracy, one in which, law enforcement might have been more than just incompetent, but actively complicit in the murders. As of this recording, in 2025, no one has ever been convicted for any of the Jennings 8 murders. The case does remain open, however. If you have any information regarding this case, you can contact the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office. Their crime tip line is 337-275-8188. Their non-emergency line is 337-821-2100. You can also submit a tip online. If you do have information and would rather contact a different agency, you can always contact the Louisiana State Police, either online at their website or by calling the Fusion Center hotline at 1-800-434-8007. I think it's important to remember that this story isn't just about the Jennings 8 themselves, but about their moms, their sisters, their children, and their friends. These women deserve more than just this shallow label of addict or a person living a high-risk lifestyle. All 8 of these women had their lives cut short. Maybe, just maybe, someone somewhere still holds the pieces to this puzzle that will help solve their case. This could be something they heard, a memory that they have, or just some kind of detail that could finally bring peace to these families who have waited far too long. Thank you. Thank you all so much for listening. If you have any thoughts, theories, just want to share any ideas, I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to leave a comment, especially on YouTube. That's where I visit the most often. And if you do have a moment, check out my Patreon. That's where you get access to perks like ad-free videos and ones that are uncensored. If this isn't your thing, you don't want to spend any money, that's totally okay. You can still support the channel by just clicking the subscribe button on YouTube. It doesn't cost anything, but it does help the channel grow. Thank you all so much again. We will talk real soon. Bye for now.